Whoa, it's a video about Faye, and it's not a jumbled mess of a yap session this time? Nope, it's always a yap session. We're talking about heroes, for God's sake. Okay, just by the title alone, you probably already have a unit in your mind that takes the crowning achievement of, being treated like piss, I guess. There's well over 1,200 units in this game, and the number's only gonna keep increasing, so naturally somebody's going to get the brunt end of it all each month. Not to mention there are a million billion qualifiers that could apply to basically anything, to the point where someone could argue Camilla is the worst treated character in Heroes. But I'm not gonna be the guy that argues that. That said, I think the topic of someone being poorly treated has come up so many times that it could easily warrant its own video. Hi guys, Z here, look at what video I'm making. And a lot of it might just come off as the "you took my only food, now I'm gonna starve" SpongeBob bit just by the intro alone, but I think it's an interesting topic nonetheless, which is why I wanted to make the video in the first place. So, let's talk about Faye's most poorly treated. Firstly, I think the most important aspect of the entire video: how do you even define it? I think if there was a clearly defined way of determining what being poorly treated in Fire Emblem Heroes was, then this video wouldn't be nearly as long as it is, and even attempting to find a clear definition of it is just going to be shaky, because outside of this being a giant woe is me type of topic, it's such a broad topic that you could realistically have it fit into so many types of definitions, like their usability, art, writing, so on and so forth. Although if it were based on writing alone, then you could look no further than everyone's favorite tomato-loving homeboy Leo, who likes beef stew more. That said, two of the most common things I tend to see when it comes to this topic includes a character getting new content in the game and they absolutely suck, and when a character doesn't get nearly as much content as other characters relative to their popularity. And while the latter is much easier to sympathize with, looking at Finn over there, the former tends to be much more mixed, as a lot of people simply value having a unit be in the game regardless of their strength. That said, I don't think either side is without its merits either, because in a game where being a good for nothing unit means you're only usable in 5% of the game's content, there's only so much enjoyment that can be had with that unit, and that's much more of an issue with how Heroes handles its content in general, but you could probably see why that would bother fans of a specific character. And it's not like it's going to get much better down the line either, given everything a new unit is required to do in 2025 to be remotely useful. Really, everything past Choose Your Legend 7 marked a change for the worst in my opinion, and we're seeing more of the results that followed from it. There was already an arms race with Hardy Fighter and Broadcatcher back in Book 5, but both also enabled all types of units to perform to some degree. And near the end of Book 6, we also had the addition of arcane weapons, which for the low cost of your originality, you could have a lot of units become usable. But because units with arcanes were actually competitive enough to be used in modes like Aether Raids and Summoner Duels, IS took it upon themselves to start raising the ceiling by releasing a constant slew of units with ungodly levels of weapon text and new PRF skills to boot, which only further widened the gap between generics and premiums, which, you know, that's kind of why we're at the point we're at. You can look back at a lot of the earlier times where some units dominated the game, but it wasn't to a point where you couldn't use most units in the game. It just took a bit of elbow grease here and there. Unless you were a ranged flyer, they were by far the most unusable type of units in the entire game for like 6 years. And maybe that could be its own video, but the point I'm getting at is that even with some representation in the game, it does make sense for people to think a unit is poorly treated if they aren't usable at the bare minimum. And with every passing month adding about 12 new units into the game, I get to remind myself how poorly this video aged. That said, I personally find myself on the other side of the argument, where I do think having unit representation is already really good as is, and while it could always be better, and that could also be said for a lot of stuff, the meta changes way too quickly for it to mean much at the end of the day, and I would rather just have a unit in the game in some capacity than not at all. Realistically, someone is going to get the short end of the stick in some capacity, and while that may suck for some characters, especially ones that are historically known for being stronger than their mainline counterpart, you know, like Seth, it does at the very least give some others a time to shine, which is something I'll always at least appreciate about Heroes. Of course, that strength might be curved towards some units over others, but it does apply nonetheless. Okay, let's be real, it's usually the Demo and Tempest Trial generic men versus the premium super decked out women most of the time. If you've played the game long enough, you know that's the case. Except for the Lords most of the time, since they're more or less the exception to the rule set in the game, barring units like Seliph, who really is just the most obligatory unit of all time. Doesn't really get anything to himself unless they just have to add it like a legendary or brave. That said, Roy also tends to come up in discussions like these when it comes to the worst treated Lord, but ranking Lords really is the pinnacle of your greed is ruining the economy to me. Although if my dad also stole my weapon refund too, I'd probably be in the same boat as everybody else is. But even beyond beyond that, there was never really a version of him that took off that much, and it would have been his Brave version if not for the aforementioned. Still, I would argue that it only made the prospect of investing into him the problem, and Eliwood having Brave Roy's weapon didn't make Brave Roy a bad unit, but I digress. That could be its own thing too. People believe that main characters or lords should have powerful versions in the game as a default for being in that role, and I myself agree with that to an extent. I don't think every version of them should be bending the game over, but having a bunch of versions of a main character constantly underperform is definitely going to hit differently to a lot of people than a side character getting shafted often. But again, I do think it's more interesting when we get characters that normally never really were able to shine in their main line just do it here. And it's not like they're ever just gonna stop getting content. They're still main lords. You know, maybe unless it's Seliph. But with that said, it's harder to sympathize with a character when they have like 5 or more versions, whether or not they're a lord. But at the very least, a lot of these units tend to get very good art, with the exception of very glaring outliers that come up every so often. There's not really a whole lot that I think can be added to the discussion when regarding art, because it more or less is equivalent to the quantity over quality discussion with alts just a moment ago. That said, art on any edition will leave a big impression, regardless of how popular the character is, especially the neutral art, and for many that just want a new character or alt, it's definitely the biggest make or break for people. I think a fair bit of players will build characters just on appearance alone, and that's not a bad thing, of course. I think it's just more of an observation than anything else, which gives me the impression that the art aspect is worth mentioning. Although to what degree, I'm not exactly sure, but I don't think anyone really likes it when a character gets added to the game with really mediocre or bad art. Of course, if they end up as strong units, then that maybe overrides it. I don't know, maybe, right? Although being dropped into the game as a generic staff unit is very much the definition of a death sentence, because that's the best the unit is ever going to be. That said, I think additions tend to be more good than bad, and they've been better about it at least these days. Ignoring the mandatory alts on every new banner, but I get it, you gotta sell banners. IS has been pretty good about giving out some content to the characters that, in my opinion, were just extremely overdue, or just have not gotten anything in the slightest that we're now seeing for, which I think is pretty cool. And because of that, having to determine a character as FEH's most poorly treated starts becoming a lot harder, even with all of the aspects mentioned. I probably would have said somebody like Long Ku if I released this video before spring, but this is after spring, so
hop out of my way.
That said, if I had to choose any character as FEH's most poorly treated, I think it would have to encompass both being bad and getting virtually no content, so you could probably cross off anybody with at least 2 or more versions in the game. Of course, I think it would also have to be somebody within a reasonable standing amongst its player base as well, because while I could easily bring up somebody like Corel, I don't think you'll have an army of people ready to defend his honor or just vouch for him in any sense. That said, I do think it would be really awesome if he joined his family at the Spring Festival one day, but I digress. And of course, that doesn't really cover the elephant in the room when it comes to characters that are just not in heroes whatsoever, but it's called Worst Traded FEH Unit, and you know, I will say I do think some characters probably should have gone in by this point, but there's only so much you can do and say about that. I'm still rooting for some of you guys out there. Believe me, I really am. But with all that said, if there was really anybody that I could think is the most poorly treated character in this game, I think it would have to be Kaze. Initially being dumped into the game as a lackluster reward unit for the then new game mode Grand Conquest, Kaze was already limited by default and wasn't remotely on par with the then better demote South. Even on the metrics of stats, he wasn't able to be summoned for a good while either, so the gap was even bigger as a result, and unless you played Grand Conquest at the time, he was virtually unattainable. Also not helping Kaze's case was his art, which, while definitely the most subjective part about this, I think was fairly lacking. Do you get it? Kaze would eventually get a refund down the road, which was fairly good all things considered, and I've made mention of that several times in the past, but he really was just a weaker man's Volk at the end of the day. And being a weaker version of a more expensive unit isn't the worst thing by any means, but he really was just there. Unlike in his main appearance, as they'll kill him off inexplicably if you don't have him at an A support with Corn, which is not told to you in the game at any point. Phenomenal decision. I think Kaze will eventually get something down the line if Ninja Saizo is any indication, but when the frontrunner for retainer alts heavily leans on Kagero and Hana, it's hard to picture when exactly it will happen. So for now, I'll continue to cope. I was initially going to have Sumi as my pick, but I decided she's probably better off as an honorable mention instead. She's here for more or less the same reasons as Kaze, but she does have nice art at least. And while I don't really want to get into the discussion of a character deserving or not deserving something, because I think it's just a really bad topic that is just kind of reductive at the end of the day. I will say I'm just kind of surprised Sumiya hasn't gotten anything, even ignoring the Chloe thing with Cordelia backpack, which I think she may have been a better choice, but I think that's neither here nor there. And it's nothing against Cordelia, of course. I just think it would have better fit, and really anybody I may have mentioned in the video, there's literally no ill will. It's more so just for the sake of discussion, but some characters are just there to help sell, which I think is totally fair. Maybe we'll get her on a summer alt because they keep doing the Shepherd, so I wouldn't be surprised if she got something maybe this year or maybe next year. I don't know. But yeah, this would be my pick for Faye's worst treated unit. Or I guess units plural, because I put Sumiya there as well. As unfortunate as it may be, I think some characters are just not going to get anything ever, which sucks, because the one thing I do want to see by the end of the game's life is virtually most, if not all, of the Fire Emblem cast across basically the entire series just put into the game. And I don't think it's going to happen, but it would be really awesome to see. If anything, it just makes me appreciate what we do have in the game as is, and hopefully it will just get even better over time. That said, I'm pretty sure y'all have different opinions on who's the most poorly treated character in the game, so let me know down below, and until next time, hopefully it probably won't be another Pity Fest video. Also, obligatory Stephan shout out. I'm really waiting for you to get in.